Chapter 3. What do we know? Learning objectives. 3.1 Describe the criteria used to develop the classical definition of knowledge. 3.2 Summarize the key elements of the three theories of knowledge. 3.3 Explain the influence of theories of knowledge in evaluating arguments. Why knowledge matters. 3.1 Describe the criteria used to develop the classical definition of knowledge. On 17 April 2016, the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) determined during a routine inspection of the quality of drinking water that the average Los Angeles tap water contained 12% Xanax and 4% oxycodone. Xanax, a well-known anxiety medication, and oxycodone, a popular pain relief pill, were found in the highest concentration rates around Brentwood, West Hollywood, and Beverly Hills. This is a memorable news story. It is so enticing to believe that people in Hollywood are heavy users of Xanax and Oxycontin. There is, however, one major problem. The story is false. It is an example of so-called fake news. According to the internet site BuzzFeed, the story, although invented and false, was among the 30 most successful fake news stories of 2016. The story was shared by more than 2 million users on Facebook. One reason why fake news stories are so eagerly shared is that they contain claims which people want to believe are true. In this way, fake news can shape the beliefs of people faster than the truth. There are many reasons of why this is a frightening phenomenon, but fake news also affects the practice of doing philosophy. We have seen in the last chapter that philosophers rely on the power of arguments when developing and justifying their claims about the world. Arguments are, however, only fully reliable if the premises of the arguments are true. Consider, for instance, the following argument. 1. All news stories are fake news stories. 2. All fake news stories are false. Therefore, all news stories are false. This argument is perfectly valid. There is nothing wrong with the logical form of this argument. However, the first premise is wrong, and because it is wrong, it leads to a conclusion that is wrong as well. Perfectly fine logical reasoning can lead to the spread of false beliefs. In order to prevent this from happening, we have to become very careful about what premises to accept in our arguments. It is not enough to believe that a premise is true. We actually have to know that this is the case. Only if we know that the premises of our arguments are true can we have complete confidence that our well-reasoned arguments lead to true conclusions as well. This is one of the reasons why the theory of knowledge, epistemology, is of importance to philosophy. The following chapter explores some fundamental questions in the theory of knowledge that are central to the practice of philosophy. Knowledge, belief, and other propositional attitudes. Let us start by taking a closer look at some facts. Right now, as I am looking outside my window, I see multiple raindrops running down the window pane. I thus form the following belief. 1. It is raining. The first thing to notice here is that this belief can be expressed by different sentences. I could as well have said, 2. Rain precipitation is occurring outside. Or 3. Is regnet. Although 1, 2, and 3 are different sentences, they all express the same content. In philosophy, we look beyond sentences and instead concentrate on the content. Philosophers, therefore, focus on propositions. A proposition is the content of an assertive sentence. Sentences 1, 2, and 3 all express the same proposition. What is interesting to notice in this context is that we can take different attitudes towards the same proposition. Take a look at the following example. 4. The Broncos will win the next Super Bowl. Here are various ways in which I can relate to this proposition. 4a. I doubt that the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl. 4b. I hope that the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl. 4c. I believe that the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl. Doubt, hope, and belief are all examples of what philosophers call propositional attitudes. Knowledge too is a propositional attitude, for I could have said 4d. I know that the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl. Although knowledge is similar to the other propositional attitudes, there is one feature that makes knowledge unique. When I claim to know something, I am not merely making a statement about myself. In addition, I am making a statement about the world and how I am related to the world. In order to see this, it is useful to look at the following two examples. 5. I believe that 2 plus 3 equals 6. 6. I know that 2 plus 3 equals 6. Statement 5 is unusual, but not wrong. It is possible to believe that 2 plus 3 equals 6. A young child who has just started to learn how to count might hold that belief. However, the same cannot be said about statement 6. It is not possible to know that 2 plus 3 equals 6. Nobody can do that. The reason why this is impossible is because knowledge requires truth. This feature of knowledge is often called the factivity of knowledge. Knowledge requires that there is a relationship between us, our cognitive states, and the way the world is. When we know something, we successfully capture and understand part of the world in which we live. This explains why knowledge is so powerful and why knowledge can be the envy of those who do not have it. Searching for a definition of knowledge. Let us apply the logical tools that we learned in the last chapter to aid us in our search for a precise definition of knowledge. Having a precise definition of knowledge will help us decide in what circumstances we either possess or lack knowledge. We have already seen that belief and knowledge are different from each other. However, there is nevertheless a relationship between belief and knowledge. Suppose, for example, that I utter this claim, I know that the world is round. If this claim is true, it follows immediately that I also believe that the world is round. Knowledge presupposes belief. Believing that something is the case is, therefore, a necessary condition for knowing that something is the case. Finding one necessary condition for knowledge is a first step in our quest for an adequate definition. If we keep on searching, we might find other necessary conditions that together might be jointly sufficient for knowledge. Does strong belief lead to knowledge? It is apparent that we trust some of our beliefs more than others. I believe, for instance, that I will still be alive in the year 2050. But this is a relatively weak belief. I would not be surprised if this belief turned out to be false. If someone were to ask me to bet on the belief, I would sensibly decline. There are, however, some beliefs on which I would be willing to wager. I believe, for example, that I am not going to be a millionaire by the end of this year. I believe this very strongly, and I am willing to bet on it. Since we hold some beliefs very dear to our hearts, we might suspect that the strength of a belief is the key to knowledge. If this were correct, we could say that strongly believing something to be true is sufficient for knowledge. Unfortunately, this does not lead to a satisfactory definition. In order to illustrate the shortcomings of this definition, it is instructive to consider the following counterexample. Suppose you buy a lottery ticket, and suppose the chance of winning is 1,1,000,000,000. Given these odds, you probably believe very strongly that the ticket you bought is a dud. Nonetheless, would you feel justified in saying that you know that the ticket is a dud? Obviously not. It is only after the drawing, when you have compared the numbers on your ticket with the winning numbers, that you can claim to know that the ticket is a losing ticket. You did not know this all along. Even if you believed it strongly all along, knowledge requires more than strong belief. So, strong belief is not sufficient for knowledge. However, recall that we observed earlier that knowledge is linked with truth. We called this the factivity of knowledge, that is, we can only know something if it is indeed true. This suggests an additional necessary condition for knowledge: we can only know something if it is true. If we combine this new necessary condition with our first necessary condition, we arrive at the following definition: knowledge is a true belief. Is knowledge true belief? Is the idea of defining knowledge as true belief adequate? Is truth together with belief jointly sufficient for knowledge? The following example should help to answer this question. Consider the fictional case of Mike, who participates in the quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? He is asked the name of the Greek city-state that defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. Mike has never studied ancient Greek history, nor has he ever heard about the Battle of Marathon. He nevertheless selects Athens as the right answer. In this situation, Mike had the belief that Athens was the right answer, and the belief actually turned out to be true, but it is clear that Mike did not know the answer. He was simply guessing, and guessing, even if it turns out to be true, is not the same thing as knowing. Truth and belief are therefore not jointly sufficient to establish knowledge. In order to make further progress in our search for an adequate definition of knowledge, it is instructive to reflect on the example of Mike and the quiz show in more detail. Notice how different our impression of Mike would have been if he had responded to the question as follows: "I'm certain that either Sparta or Athens defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon, since these were the two dominant Greek military powers in the 5th century BCE. The Persians attacked from the east, but Sparta was located on the Peloponnese, a bit more in the west. It seems more likely, therefore, that the Athenians fought and defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon, since Athens is located on the eastern shore." Here Mike would have been providing a justification for his belief that Athens fought against the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. If Mike is able to justify his belief, we would conclude quite naturally that he has some knowledge about ancient Greek history. So, justification in addition to truth is a further crucial component of knowledge. What we mean here by justification is the ability of the putative knower to state an argument that supports the conclusion that the belief in question is likely to be true. Of course, it is not quite clear how strong the justification argument must be before we can count the belief as knowledge. Mike's justification for his belief about Athens, for example, is not terribly impressive. We will see later that different philosophers make different demands in this context. However, it is safe to say that knowing P requires some form of justification for the belief that P is likely to be true. Together, these three criteria put us in a position to formulate the classical, tripartite definition of knowledge. According to this definition, belief, truth, and justification are three necessary conditions for knowledge, which together are jointly sufficient. In short, knowledge is true, justified belief. This classical definition has been around since Plato, ca. 428 ca. 347 BC, who was the first philosopher to suggest it. In recent times, some epistemologists have challenged this definition. They claim to have found cases in which this definition is not quite adequate and conclude that another condition is needed. Although this is an important concern, we cannot pursue it in the context of an introduction to epistemology. For our purposes, the classical definition of knowledge is precise enough, and we will use it in the remainder of this chapter. Food for thought. In order to practice your understanding of the different propositional attitudes, complete the following exercise by filling in the gaps from the following list of options. I know that. I hope that. I believe that. I do not believe that. I do not know that. The completed sentences should all be true. Please complete your answers with others in class. 1. That God exists. 2. That I am not afraid of death. 3. That I am today the same person I was when I was 5 years old. 4. That humans are causing global. 5. That stealing is wrong. 6. That in 20,121 96% of US Americans visited McDonald's at least once. 7. That planet Earth is more than 5 billion years old. 8. That more than 30% of US teenagers have sent or published nude pictures of themselves. 9. That I can forgive those who have done me wrong in the past. 10. That I have free will. 11. That while in college George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the USA, was captain of the Yale cheerleading squad. Food for thought. Practice your understanding of the classical definition of knowledge by deciding whether the following sentences, uttered by you, are true or false. If you think that a sentence is true, provide a justification for thinking so. 1. I know that I have 2 hands. 2. I know that my physical death is the end of my existence. 3. I know that other people experience the smell of coffee just as I do. 4. I know that the number 3 is larger than the number 2. 5. I know that water is H2O. 6. I know that killing people is wrong. 7. I know that I'm awake right now. 8. I know that dinosaurs have existed on Earth in the past. 9. I know that there are 9 planets in our solar system. 10. I know that there exists life on other planets. Food for thought. Situations seem to exist, so-called Gettier cases, in which true, justified beliefs do not amount to genuine knowledge. Can you think of such situations? 3 different theories of knowledge. 3. To summarize the key elements of the 3 theories of knowledge. The discussion in the last section has given us a better idea of what knowledge is, but we have yet to answer the most essential question in epistemology: what do we know? It would be ideal if we could answer this question once and for all, but the question is, as are all philosophical questions, an open one, meaning that there is more than one way in which we can answer it. The key objective is to develop a satisfactory theory of epistemic justification. We have seen that knowledge is true, justified belief. Therefore, if we can clearly determine when and how our beliefs are justified, we can also determine the scope and limit of our knowledge. Not surprisingly, different philosophers have developed different theories in response to this question. Our task is to consider which theory appears most reasonable. Roughly speaking, we can identify 3 major theories of knowledge: skepticism, empiricism, and rationalism. The 3 positions are illustrated in the chart. The chart is, of course, an oversimplification. In addition to skepticism, empiricism, and rationalism, alternate and more refined epistemological positions exist. It is nevertheless useful to focus on these 3 major epistemological theories. Skepticism. The case for skepticism. A skeptic is someone who denies that we have genuine knowledge. According to the skeptic, we have only beliefs about the world, and none of these beliefs can count as knowledge. We can distinguish among different forms of skepticism. On the one hand is global, universal skepticism, which holds that no knowledge of any kind about any subject matter is possible. It is rare that someone explicitly advocates global skepticism because it seems to undermine itself. Since global skeptics claim that there is no knowledge whatsoever, they themselves cannot know whether global skepticism is true or not. Later on, however, we will see how global skepticism can emerge in a more indirect and thus more threatening way. A more attractive form of skepticism can be dubbed local skepticism. It is more limited in scope than global skepticism and focuses on particular fields of knowledge or particular methods of justification. A local skeptic will say that we cannot have knowledge about certain subjects, example, God or the existence of the external physical world, or that certain ways of acquiring beliefs, such as reading fortune cookies, can never produce knowledge. Clearly, we are all local skeptics with respect to some ways of acquiring beliefs. I am, for example, a skeptic about psychic hotlines. If you were to tell me that you broke up with your partner because a psychic informed you that your partner was seeing someone else, I would think you were extremely gullible. Your belief that your partner was unfaithful would seem completely unjustified. You certainly would be wrong to claim that you knew it on the basis of that telephone call. I am also a skeptic about astrology and alternative medicine, although a fair number of people put great faith in horoscopes and herbal treatments. A local skeptic seeks to establish that a particular type of justification does not link our beliefs to the truth. For example, if you claim to know that you will spend a dream vacation with your partner because the moon is in Sagittarius, a skeptic about astrology would question the validity of your belief justification. How in the world, the skeptic would ask, is the position of the moon related to your vacation and your relationship? Unless there is some plausible connection, the skeptic would seem to be in a strong position to reject all astrological belief justifications. You could, of course, hold on to your belief that the position of the moon has an effect on your vacation, but the skeptic would have shown that this belief does not amount to knowledge. It seems epistemically irresponsible to modify a belief about a relationship because of a belief about the position of the moon. Although most people agree that astrology and psychic hotlines are not reliable ways to acquire true beliefs, the question arises about whether we can trust any other methods of acquiring beliefs. I acquire, for example, a fair number of my beliefs about the world from reading the New York Times. But are the beliefs I acquire from reading the NYT so much more reliable than the beliefs I acquire from the psychic hotline? Sure, the psychic hotline is often wrong, but isn't the NYT often wrong as well? This is actually the sneaky way in which global skepticism can make it stand. If it turns out that local skepticism is plausible with respect to all subject areas and all ways of acquiring and justifying beliefs, then local skepticism has suddenly turned into global skepticism. In the remaining part of this chapter, we will investigate what form of skepticism can and should be avoided. Descartes' quest for certainty. The French philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, was the first modern philosopher who addressed the question of whether we can prevent skepticism from undermining every claim to knowledge. Descartes lived during confusing times, as we do now. The 17th century was a period of change in Europe. The Reformation had weakened the credibility of religious authorities. New scientific thinking was challenging traditional ways of thinking about physics and the universe. In short, the 17th century produced a hodgepodge of competing beliefs about God and the universe. But which of these beliefs were worthy of being called knowledge? Descartes asked. To find an answer to this question, Descartes followed an original strategy. According to him, we cannot trust any of our beliefs as long as there is any chance that they might be mistaken. He wrote, I ought no less carefully to withhold my assent from matters which are not entirely certain and indubitable than from those which appear to me manifestly to be false. Through doubting and examining all of his beliefs, Descartes attempted to distill those beliefs that were certain and indubitable. He thought that only these beliefs truly deserved to be considered knowledge. This method of distinguishing mere belief from knowledge is often called Descartes' method of doubt. To respond to the threat of skepticism, let us follow this Cartesian method of doubt. Are there beliefs that we cannot doubt are true? In day-to-day life, most people do not doubt that what they see is true. When I walk across the street and see a truck approaching, I have little reason to doubt that the truck is really bearing down on me. I trust my senses and get out of the way of the truck. But are our perceptual beliefs, that is, those beliefs that are formed on the basis of perception, indubitable and certain? Descartes said they are not. René Descartes tried to find knowledge by finding beliefs which he could not doubt to be true. To show that it is possible to doubt what our senses tell us, Descartes presented a series of skeptical arguments. One of them is the famous dream argument, which can be presented in standard form as follows. 1. If it is possible that I am dreaming right now, then I have reason to doubt whether my current perceptual beliefs are true. 2. It is possible that I am dreaming right now. Therefore, I have reason to doubt whether my current perceptual beliefs are true. My perceptual beliefs are not indubitable and certain. Beginning students often misunderstand Descartes' dream argument. The point of the argument is not to show that one is dreaming or that life can be a dream. The point of the argument is simply to show that our current perceptual beliefs, the beliefs that are based on what I see, feel, and hear right now, are not indubitable or absolutely certain. The argument is an instance of the argument form modus ponens, which we discussed in Chapter 2. It is therefore valid. We thus need to turn our attention to the question of whether the argument is sound. Are the premises of the argument true? The first premise appears very reasonable. For instance, at this very moment, it seems to me that I am sitting in front of a computer. I am hearing the little humming noise of the ventilator, and I see the cursor blinking. However, if it is possible that these experiences are part of a vivid dream, then I have reason to doubt whether I am indeed sitting in front of a computer. If it should be the case that I am really dreaming at this very moment, then I am probably lying in bed and there is no computer in front of me. So, premise 1 seems true. If it is possible that I am dreaming, then I have reason to doubt whether my current perceptual beliefs are true. What about the second premise? Is it really possible that I am dreaming at this very moment? I feel very awake. I see my fingers moving across the keyboard. I remember waking up this morning and having breakfast, but does any of this make it certain that I am awake? Descartes said no and supported his claim with the following line of reasoning. 1. It is impossible to distinguish with certainty between dream experiences and waking experiences. 2. If it is impossible to distinguish with certainty between dream experiences and waking experiences, then I cannot know whether I am awake right now. 3. If I cannot know that I am awake right now, then it is possible that I am dreaming right now. Therefore, it is possible that I am dreaming right now. This argument is a combination of two valid argument forms ponens and hypothetical syllogism and is therefore valid. Premises 2 and 3 are very plausible. The key premise is premise I. Might this premise be false? Might it be possible to distinguish with certainty between waking experiences and dream experiences? Sure, sometimes when I am dreaming, I am aware that my experiences are part of a dream. However, this is not always the case. Some dreams are so vivid that I am convinced that my dream experiences are real. How then can I tell with certainty that my current perceptual experiences are not dream experiences? Any experience that I can have right now one can, at least in principle, also experience while I am dreaming. It follows therefore that I cannot eliminate the possibility that I am right now dreaming completely. Although my belief that I am right now awake is a strong one, I would be willing to bet a good deal of money on it. I have to acknowledge that the belief is not absolutely certain to be true. There retrains the genuine possibility that my current experiences are actually part of an amazingly realistic dream. The essential idea behind the dream argument can be presented in a variety of ways. Descartes, for example, considered not only the possibility that we might be dreaming but also the possibility that there might exist a devious and powerful demon that uses all its powers to deceive us. Descartes called such a being an evil genius and argued that we could not be certain that such a being does not exist. In recent times, philosophers have presented Descartes' skeptical worries in a scenario suggesting that any of us might simply be a brain in a vat. Imagine a brain suspended in a liquid and wired to a computer, which feeds the brain all the current experiences you are having right now. If you were such a brain, nothing in your experience would reveal that you were actually a brain in a vat. You might believe that you were a 6-foot-tall, brown-haired dude from California reading a philosophy book, but that belief, together with all your other perceptual beliefs, would be false. These skeptical arguments even find their way into popular movies. The movie The Matrix, for example, is constructed around the idea that we only appear to be living in a normal world. In reality, we are lying in bathtubs wired to the matrix while machines harvest our energy. It is important not to lose sight of the point of these skeptical arguments. Descartes tried to find beliefs that are indubitable and certain. These skeptical arguments are designed to show that there are no such beliefs. Every belief seems to be subject to doubt. How can we respond to this challenge? 3 answers seem possible. First, we can simply accept global skepticism. If knowledge requires that we have to be certain that our beliefs are true, then we have to conclude in light of these skeptical arguments that knowledge does not exist. Second, we can follow Descartes and try to find certainty in spite of these arguments. This might seem impossible, but Descartes suggested an ingenious argument. Assume that the worst-case scenario is true and that we are brains in vats or are deceived by an evil genius. In this case, it seems we must doubt everything. However, Descartes discovered something interesting about doubt. In order to understand this, let's look at several examples of doubt. 1. I doubt that it will rain tomorrow. 2. I doubt that I am awake right now. 3. I doubt that I have a physical body. 4. 1 doubt that I am thinking. The first 3 examples of doubt are not problematic, but 4 raises some interesting questions. Is it possible for me to doubt that I am thinking? In order to doubt that I am thinking, is it not necessary that I think? What Descartes discovered was that we cannot legitimately doubt that we are thinking. However, if we cannot doubt that we are thinking, when we are thinking, then we can also know that we are thinking, when we are thinking. This then is the absolute certain starting point Descartes has been trying to find all along. As long as we think, we can know that we are thinking. Moreover, Descartes also had another insight: thinking is a very special activity. Thinking cannot happen by itself. I'll Thinking requires somebody who is doing the thinking. Who is this somebody who is doing the thinking which I can know to be going on? It is me. Thus, Descartes concluded, after having reflected well and carefully examined all things, we must come to the definite conclusion that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it. To this is Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am, in Latin, cogito, ergo sum. It is an interesting and influential philosophical insight. Even in light of the most fundamental skepticism, Descartes claimed that he could know absolute certainty that he existed as long as he was thinking. It is worth noticing that Descartes' certainty was derived from thinking, reason, alone. Therefore, he is classified as a rationalist. He held that reason provides the most reliable foundation for all knowledge. Even if we accept Descartes' claim that I can know that I exist as long as I think, the resulting view of what little we know is somewhat discouraging. Very few things are as certain as my belief that I exist. Ultimately, Descartes' project, although Descartes himself disagreed herefor, seems to lead to a philosophical position called solipsism, which asserts that we can know only the contents of our own minds. This is a rather lonely view of the world. If solipsism is coma, it becomes very doubtful whether we can know that there is an external world or that there are other people with minds like us. But it surely seems as if we do know that there are trees, cars, and other people in the world besides us. It is therefore tempting to look for an alternative to Descartes' epistemic project. The third and for me most attractive response to Cartesian skepticism is to modify our demands for epistemic justification. As we have seen, Descartes insisted that we can know something only if we can be certain that the belief in question is true. In short, Descartes required epistemic justification to be infallible. That is perhaps too high a standard for justification. It might be quite reasonable to say that I am justified to believe that P is the case even if there is a chance that the justification for my belief in P will later be defeated by additional evidence. For example, suppose that it is Saturday night and that you are watching Saturday Night Live. You hear the actors on the show utter several times that the show is broadcast live from New York. In this situation, it seems plausible to say that you are justified to believe that you are watching a live broadcast. Later, however, as you watch the credits for the show, you find out that the show was actually a recording. Although your reasons for thinking that the show was a live broadcast were later defeated, you had prima facie reasons for thinking that the show was a live broadcast. The term prima facie is Latin for at first sight and refers to evidence that is immediately available. It is tempting to construct a viable theory of epistemic justification on the basis of prima facie justification. To illustrate how such a theory might look, let us consider the Saturday Night Live example one more time. Suppose you are in the same situation. You are watching Saturday Night Live on a Saturday evening and hear the actors announce that the show is a live broadcast. Suppose further that it is indeed a live broadcast. In this scenario, you had prima facie reasons for thinking that the show was a live broadcast, and these prima facie reasons were not later defeated by other evidence. It is tempting to think that prima facie justification that goes undefeated might be sufficient for knowledge. Such justification is obviously neither certain nor infallible, but it might nevertheless be the kind of justification we are looking for. The danger we face is that such justification might permit too many weakly justified beliefs to count as knowledge. To determine whether there is room for a plausible, prima facie version of justification that is strong enough to lead to knowledge, we will have to take a closer look at two of the most attractive sources of prima facie justification for belief, experience, and reason. We will start our discussion by investigating the most common theory of knowledge, empiricism. Food for thought. Descartes' cogito is much more complex than it appears at first glance. Descartes seemed to assert that as long as he was thinking, he could know with absolute certainty that the sentence "I think" was true, and he could conclude therefore that the sentence "I exist" had to be true as well. Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, discussed the cogito in his book The Problems of Philosophy, but some care is needed in using Descartes' argument "I think, therefore I am" says rather more than is strictly certain. It might seem as though we were quite sure of being the same person today as we were yesterday, and this is no doubt true in some sense. But the real self is as hard to arrive at as the real table and does not seem to have that absolute, convincing certainty that belongs to particular experiences. When I look at my table and see a certain brown color, what is quite certain at once is not I am seeing a brown color, but rather, a brown color is being seen. This of course involves something, or somebody, which, or who, sees the brown color, but it does not of itself involve that more or less permanent person whom we call I. So far as immediate certainty goes, it might be that the something which sees the brown color is quite momentary, and not the same as the something which has some different experience the next moment. What do you think? Do you agree with Russell's criticism? Food for thought. Descartes himself did not think that his insistence that knowledge must be founded on an absolutely certain foundation created unsurmountable problems. He concluded that in addition to knowing that he himself exists, he also could know that an all-good God exists, and that an all-good God guarantees that he can trust all clear and distinct ideas to be true. These results seem too optimistic to many who read his meditations. Contrary to his own conclusions, many readers of Descartes' meditations walked away with the impression that nothing could be known besides the fact that one is a thinking being. In 1663, 13 years after Descartes' death, the Catholic Church put his meditations on the list of prohibited books for spreading skepticism and atheism. Empiricism. Empiricism is a very plausible and intuitive theory of knowledge. It is closely associated with the British philosophers John Locke, 1630–1704, George Berkeley, 1685–1753, and David Hume, 1711–1776. An empiricist maintains that we can know something if we can justify it with respect to what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. Assume, for instance, that I am right now looking at my right hand, and I see that I have 5 fingers on this hand. This perception triggers in me the belief that I have 5 fingers on my right hand. Moreover, this perception, together with my belief that my eyes are working properly, bestows such a high degree of justification on my belief that I am very confident that I know that I have 5 fingers on my right hand. Empiricists believe that examples such as these are paradigm examples of knowledge. Our beliefs about the world are most reliable when they can be justified with the help of our experiences of the world. Historically, empiricism is also associated with the idea that we are born as a tabula rasa, Latin for blank slate, which means that all of our ideas and concepts are derived from experience. Let us call beliefs that are directly derived from our experiences basic empirical beliefs. For instance, my seeing a red telephone triggers in me the belief that there is a red telephone in front of me. This belief is a basic empirical belief since it is a direct result of certain specific experiences. An empiricist maintains that basic empirical beliefs, in ordinary circumstances, are strongly justified beliefs and count as evidence. The precise way in which basic empirical beliefs are justified is a matter of philosophical controversy. We will see in a later section that an empiricist faces some tough questions in this context. But setting aside possible difficulties, let us agree with the empiricist that basic empirical beliefs are justified and count as evidence and instances of knowledge. The next step for empiricists is to insist that inferential beliefs that are about what is not directly observable must be justified with the help of basic empirical beliefs. For example, the belief that dinosaurs once roamed the earth is not a basic empirical belief. I cannot see, touch, or feel any dinosaurs in my backyard or in a zoo. It is, however, possible to justify this belief in light of what I can see right now, namely bones and other paleontological remains, example, preserved footprints. It follows, therefore, that an empiricist would consider the inferential belief that dinosaurs once roamed the earth as justified by available empirical evidence. An empiricist insists that all such inferential claims that are to count as knowledge must be justified by empirical evidence. Empiricists are therefore skeptical about any beliefs that cannot be confirmed or falsified by empirical evidence. For example, the claim that all men are created equal is not linked in any obvious way to empirical observations. An empiricist would therefore conclude that we can believe this, but that we cannot know this to be so. Similarly, an empiricist would be skeptical about a claim like God wrote the Bible, for it is hard to see how that belief can be justified in terms of basic empirical beliefs. In general, many empiricists are skeptical about claims of moral, arid religious knowledge. There is something sobering and appealing about empiricism. An empiricist will not quickly jump to grand conclusions, but will carefully consider the empirical evidence and see what conclusions are plausible in light of that evidence. If the evidence is insufficient to support any final conclusions, an empiricist will withhold judgment. The case for empiricism. Several arguments suggest that empiricism is the most promising epistemic theory. First, empiricists justify all knowledge in relation to basic empirical beliefs. This approach is attractive since basic empirical beliefs seem more reliable than other beliefs. I might not know whether the stock market crash of 1929 was the main cause of the Great Depression, but I surely do seem to know how the world around me feels, sounds, and looks. There are, of course, situations in which my senses are off target and misleading, but overall, they seem to paint a pretty accurate picture of how the world is. We do not have to insist, as Descartes did, justification is infallible. Moreover, basic empirical beliefs seem directly linked to how the world around us really is. When I see a desk in front of me, something like the following seems to be happening. Light reflects off the desk into my eyes and causes cells in the retina of my eye to stimulate my optic nerves. The optic nerves, in turn, transmit information to my brain, where the visual information is processed. The details of this process are complicated, but it seems plausible to assume that we receive information through this process that produces reliable information about the desk. We do not invent what we see, feel, or hear. There is something objective about beliefs formed on the basis of empirical evidence. They are, for the most part, independent of other beliefs and directly related to how the world is. Finally, empiricism is strongly supported by the success of the natural sciences. Physics, chemistry, and biology have made tremendous progress during the last 300 years and seem to have increased our knowledge of the world. Because careful observations are an essential part of the scientific method, the success of natural science supports the conclusion that our knowledge ultimately rests on empirical evidence, and thus supports an empiricist perspective in epistemology. Problems with perception. Although empiricism is a very attractive theory of knowledge, it leads to a number of fundamental problems. We have seen that an empiricist derives knowledge from basic empirical beliefs. It follows therefore that an empiricist needs to explain how we arrive at these basic empirical beliefs and why we are justified to believe that these basic empirical beliefs are likely to be true. Thus, an empiricist has to say something about how we perceive the world. Roughly speaking, an empiricist wants to say that when we perceive a red car, we are justified to believe that there is indeed a red car out there. So an empiricist needs to establish some version of the following principle. Whenever we perceive an object P, e.g., a car, to have a property A, e.g., red, then object P has indeed property A. Let us call this the principle of perceptual realism. Unfortunately, this principle is not obviously true. To understand why there is controversy about perceptual realism, it is helpful to distinguish among three different theories of perception: naive realism, sometimes also called direct realism, indirect realism, and idealism. The basic thrust of these different theories of perception is illustrated in the adjacent graphic. Naive realism provides the best support for empiricism. If we can trust that the world outside our minds is exactly as we perceive it to be, then empiricism is by far the most promising way to gain knowledge about this world. On the other hand, naive realism is difficult to defend. First, we cannot deny that we sometimes make perceptual mistakes. It can appear to us that there is a lake in the desert, but in reality, there is no lake. It may appear to us that a stick inserted into water is bent, but in reality, it is straight. What can a naive realist say about these mistakes if they are absolutely committed to the principle that the world is exactly how it appears to us? Second and more important, there are excellent reasons for thinking that certain properties like color, heat, smell, and taste are mind-dependent properties. Consider the following situation. A person stands in front of 3 buckets of water. The bucket to the left is full of hot water, the one to the right full of cold water, and the one in the middle is full of tepid water. The person is asked to put one arm in the bucket with cold water and the other one in the bucket of hot water. The situation is depicted in the adjacent diagram. After several minutes, the person is asked to put both hands in the bucket with tepid water. What will happen? It seems plausible that the person will report the following: to my right hand the water in the middle feels cold, but to my left hand the water feels warm. This spells trouble for the naive realist. If it is possible that we perceive the same body of water as being both warm and cold at the same time, then we cannot maintain any longer that the world is exactly as we perceive it to be. Empiricists like John Locke were very much aware of this difficulty. Locke thus rejected naive realism and suggested instead that we distinguish between 2 kinds of properties: primary properties and secondary properties. According to Locke, some properties that we perceive objects to possess are not really in the objects, but rather in us, the observers. A good example is color perception. If you have ever looked at the ocean, you might recall that the color of the ocean changes constantly. At times the ocean looks blue, then gray, and on other days emerald green. So, what color does the water in the ocean really have? According to John Locke, the ocean has no color. Color is created when we look at the ocean, so color is a secondary property even that we perceive the ocean to have and that the ocean causes us to see, but that the ocean itself does not really have. Locke suggested that taste, smell, texture, and felt temperature are further secondary properties, private objects in our minds but not truly in the objects of the physical world. Locke suggested that other properties like size, shape, molecular texture, and motion are primary properties. That is, when I perceive an object to be 6 feet long, it is indeed 6 feet long. The size of a physical object is not a property that is only in my mind, its length is something the object really has. The distinction between primary and secondary properties leads to the idea of indirect realism. According to this theory of perception, the world around us is not exactly as it appears to be. The world, independent of our perception, has neither color nor smell nor taste. It consists of extended microscopic objects that possess only primary properties, namely size, shape, and motion. Since indirect realism can escape the objections that were raised against naive realism, it seems to be a more plausible theory. Moreover, it is compatible with the view that the universe ultimately exists of small physical particles and collections of these particles. This metaphysical view was held by John Locke and is also referred to as corpuscularianism. In defense of indirect realism, one succinct line of argument, which makes use of our observations about color and other secondary properties, was suggested by Michael Huemer. 1. If an object is composed entirely all parts that are colorless, that object is colorless. 2. All middle-sized physical objects are composed entirely of subatomic particles, protons, electrons, neutrons, and so on. 3. Subatomic particles are colorless. Therefore, all middle-sized physical objects are colorless. The argument is clearly valid, and all three premises are easy to accept. However, if you accept all three premises, you must also accept the idea that tables and chairs and all other middle-sized physical objects are in reality colorless and thus quite different from the way they appear in our perception. Indirect realism has thus become unavoidable. Indirect realism makes it harder to explain why empiricism is the most promising theory of knowledge. For if indirect realism is true, we cannot simply know that the world is as we perceive it to be. Indirect realism requires that we distinguish between how the world appears to our senses and how the world really is. The world as it appears to our senses has both primary and secondary properties, but the real world supposedly has only primary properties. This distinction leads to epistemic difficulties. An empiricist holds that we can know something if we can perceive it, but indirect realism removes the real world from our direct perceptual reach and drives a wedge between what we are aware of and the objective, external world. Since we cannot perceive a world without color, taste, and smell, we are unable to be directly aware of objects as they really are. An empiricist who accepts indirect realism must admit, therefore, that we cannot know the real world directly through our experiences. The best we can hope for is to infer that such an external, objective world exists. Unfortunately, such inferences cannot easily be justified in light of our experiences and thereby open the possibility that pure empiricism might lead to a form of skepticism. George Berkeley pointed to a second, more serious problem for indirect realism. The distinction between primary and secondary properties is not clear-cut. Locke had argued that color is a secondary property since the color of an object depends on how one looks at the object, that is, the same table might look blue from one perspective and gray from another. But Berkeley pointed out correctly it seems that the same can be said about primary properties as well. For instance, the shape is supposedly a primary property, but a round tire can look round from one perspective and elliptical from another. What then is the real shape of the tire? An analogous point can be made with motion, which is also considered a primary property of objects. Whether something is perceived to be in motion depends fundamentally on the perspective of the observer. Thus, the danger is that all properties of physical objects might burn out to be somewhat mind-dependent. Berkeley concluded that we should abandon the distinction between primary and secondary qualities and instead admit that the world ultimately depends on our minds. But if we have to relinquish the distinction between primary and secondary properties, we have to abandon the theory of indirect realism as well. Berkeley, a committed empiricist, was happy to draw this conclusion. He suggested that physical objects like cars, telephone poles, or toothbrushes are ultimately nothing but perceptions. Berkeley's famous phrase is "Est percipi," which is Latin for to be is to be perceived. Berkeley's position is known as idealism, which is compatible with empiricism. For if we say that physical objects are ultimately perceptions, then we can know those objects through perceptual experiences. However, idealism seems counterintuitive. Who would think that physical objects like tables and chairs are ultimately only perceptions? We have a strong inclination to think that physical objects are made out of matter that can exist independently of being perceived. Of course, the fact that a philosophical theory goes against the grain of common sense is not necessarily a serious flaw. However, all things being equal, it is always preferable to adopt a theory that squares well with our common sense view of the world. The more serious weakness in Berkeley's idealism is that it seems to make it very difficult to distinguish between true and false perceptual beliefs. In certain situations, we are prone to experience perceptual illusions. For example, when we walk through a desert, we might experience a mirage and see water in the distance, although in reality there is only hot desert sand. If we believe in the existence of a mind-independent physical world, we can explain these situations as follows. Our perceptual belief that there is water in the distance is false because our perception was not caused by water but by the hot air above the desert sand. This explanation requires us to think about the hot air above the desert sand as a mind-independent physical object, since only mind-independent physical objects can play the appropriate causal role. We have seen, however, that Berkeley's idealism denies that there are mind-independent physical objects. According to his analysis, physical objects are ultimately perceptions, so Berkeley cannot explain the mirage in the same way we just did. At this point, an idealist has two options: either decide that perceptual beliefs can never be false, or else revise the ordinary account of how perceptual beliefs can be false. The first option does not seem very attractive, and the second option suggests that idealism is philosophically rather complex. According to Occam's razor, we have reason to prefer a simpler explanation to a more complicated one. Thus, although Berkeley's idealism is a logically possible scenario, it does not offer the simplest explanation of mistaken perceptual beliefs, and we therefore have cause to be hesitant before we embrace any form of idealism. Let us quickly summarize the main conclusions of this discussion of perception. We have seen that empiricism needs a theory of perception that supports the principle that if we perceive an object P to have a property A, then object P has indeed property A. This principle is best supported by naive realism, but naive realism seems, on closer scrutiny, to give way to indirect realism about perception. And indirect realism, in turn, seems to lead to skepticism or to collapse into idealism. If we combine, as Berkeley did, idealism with empiricism, we seem to be in conflict with the principle of Occam's razor. None of this is fatal for empiricism, but it shows that an empiricist has to do serious philosophical work before being able to confidently assert that our knowledge of the world goes hand in hand with our experiences of the world. The problem of induction. The second major problem for empiricism stems from the fact that our experiences of the world can confirm or disconfirm only particular facts, not general and universal claims. For example, if we want to know whether a particular sunflower is yellow, we can simply look at that particular sunflower. However, if we want to know whether all sunflowers are yellow, we cannot directly determine that by looking at a couple of sunflowers. The empiricist needs a procedure to move from knowledge of a particular set of objects to knowledge of universal and general relationships. Such a procedure is called induction, a term we encountered in Chapter 2 when we discussed enumerative inductive arguments. The difficulty for the empiricist is to explain how and why we can know, on the basis of experience alone, that enumerative inductive arguments, or inferences, are justified. The philosopher David Hume was the first to draw attention to this difficulty. At first glance, you might wonder whether empiricists can simply give up on induction altogether and resign themselves to knowing only particular facts but not universal claims. The difficulty with this solution is that empiricism is supposed to underlie and explain the success of the empirical sciences, which rely on general laws like Newton's 3 laws of motion. These laws of nature are, of course, paradigm examples of universal claims that go beyond the limit of particular facts. If empiricism is supposed to explain how scientists can know that nature is governed by general laws, empiricists need to explain how inductive inferences can expand our knowledge. Let us consider a relatively straightforward example. Suppose that Peter is a biologist who has spent a good deal of his time observing the habits of loggerhead turtles. He observed, for instance, that loggerhead turtles come to the same beach to lay their eggs every 2 years. After observing this again and again at different beaches and with a large sample of loggerhead turtles, and after finding out that other biologists had made the same observations about loggerhead turtles, Peter inferred that loggerhead turtles lay eggs every 2 years. The enumerative inductive argument in defense of his claim looks as follows. 1. All loggerhead turtles that have been observed in the past have laid eggs every year. Therefore, all loggerhead turtles lay eggs every 2 years. This enumerative inductive argument poses an epistemic problem for the empiricist. The conclusion of the argument involves not only a judgment about what observed loggerhead turtles have done in the past, but also a prediction about what they will do in the future. Because no one has yet observed what loggerhead turtles will do in the future, an empiricist faces an epistemic problem. What reason do we have to think that unobserved loggerhead turtles will act in the future in the same way as observed loggerhead turtles have acted in the past? It is certainly logically possible that loggerhead turtles will suddenly change their egg-laying habits. When real-life scientists are confronted with this problem, they frequently point to the principle of the uniformity of nature, which claims that the course of nature is not freaky. Nature is such that the laws that govern the past will also govern the future. If this principle is accepted, we can present a better version of the argument about loggerhead turtles. 1. All loggerhead turtles that have been observed in the past have laid eggs every 2 years. 2. Nature is uniform, that is, regularities that have occurred in the past will also occur in the future. Therefore, all loggerhead turtles, past and future, lay eggs every 2 years. This argument provides a much stronger justification than the earlier version. The argument now is deductively valid. However, we are facing a new challenge. We have to provide reasons in defense of premise 2. On what basis do we know that the principle of the uniformity of nature is true? Full-blown empiricists think that their experience must provide the reason that the principle of the uniformity of nature is true. Consequently, they must argue as follows. 1. In the past we have seen that many observed regularities have continued to hold. Therefore, all observed regularities will continue to hold in the future, i.e., nature is uniform. The problems with this argument are easy to see. The argument itself is an inductive inference, which we can justify if the principle of the uniformity of nature is true. Alas, in order to know that that principle is true, we need to assume that a specific inductive inference works. We thus have come full circle. In order to show that inductive arguments are reliable, We had to appeal to the principle of the uniformity of nature, and in order to justify the principle of the uniformity of nature, we had to presuppose that inductive arguments are reliable. We thus have, as philosophers like to say, begged the question. We ended up presupposing what we tried to establish. This might not be a fatal problem for empiricism, but it shows once again that committed empiricists have philosophical work to do before they can claim that scientific laws can be known solely on the basis of experiences. A potentially elegant solution to the problem of induction is to claim that we can know the uniformity of nature not on the basis of experience, but rather with the help of reason. This would show, however, that in addition to experience, human knowledge needs a second leg to stand on, namely, reason. Philosophers who claim that our knowledge depends predominantly on reason rather than experience are called rationalists. Rationalism. Rationalism, the third major epistemic theory, is not as immediately plausible as empiricism, but there are some crucial similarities between these two major theories of knowledge. An empiricist believes that our knowledge is ultimately based on basic empirical beliefs. Rationalism is similar in that rationalists also hold that our knowledge is based on basic beliefs. The difference is that rationalists do not justify basic beliefs with the help of experience, but rather with the help of pure reason. This might sound a bit strange. What is pure reason supposed to be, and how is it supposed to lead us to knowledge? An example might help to illustrate the basic thrust of rationalism. Suppose Sarah, a skeptical friend of yours, asks, "What do you think? Is 2,763 the largest natural number?" You answer, "No, 2,763 is not the largest natural number. As a matter of fact, there is no largest natural number. For any natural number you can name, there is always a larger one." Suppose Sarah is not impressed by your answer and asks, "How in the world can you know these kinds of things? Have you looked at all natural numbers? I have a feeling that you do not really know this, but that you simply made this up." Two things seem fairly obvious at this point. First, we do indeed seem to know that there is no largest natural number, and second, we do not know this on the basis of experience. Numbers are not the kind of things we can see, feel, or touch. So, if we have knowledge about them, that knowledge cannot be based on experience, but rather on our ability to think, i.e., reason. Rationalists claim that when we think about certain propositions, we can immediately understand and grasp that the propositions must be true. For example, we can immediately grasp that the number 3 is larger than the number 2, or that any two people either know each other or they do not, or that nothing can be green and red all over at the same time. A rationalist claims that these propositions have something self-evident about them, and simple reflection suffices to show that we are justified to believe that they are likely to be true. Some technical terminology is frequently used when philosophers discuss rationalism. The kind of justification that is crucial for rationalists is called a priori, a Latin phrase that literally means from the former. The phrase is used to refer to justification that can take place prior to consulting any empirical evidence. In other words, I can know something a priori if I can know it without first seeing, touching, or hearing anything in particular. It is, for example, possible to know a priori that all red cars are colored cars, since I do not have to look at any cars to determine that the claim is true. I can also know a priori that every triangle has 3 sides. I do not have to see or touch any particular triangle in order to know that the claim is true. Students are frequently confused at this point and often say, "How can you know that all triangles have 3 sides without having experiences?" In order to know something about triangles, one surely must have seen some triangles. So, it seems false to say that one can know a priori that all triangles have 3 sides. It is important to understand that a priori does not mean justification without reference to any experiences, but rather justification without reference to any particular experience. For example, in order to know that tigers are animals, one might have to see some tigers or pictures of tigers to acquire the concept of what a tiger is. However, it is not necessary to see any particular tiger, so it is correct to say that I can know a priori that tigers are animals. Any experience that allows me to acquire the concept of a tiger is sufficient to allow me to know that tigers are animals. On the other hand, I cannot know a priori whether my neighbors have a ferocious tiger in their basement. In order to know that, I need to inspect their basement. One need to have a particular experience. A priori justification is normally contrasted with a posteriori justification, a Latin phrase that literally means from the latter. A posteriori justification is a kind of justification that is typical for empiricism. It requires that we refer to specific experiences of the world. For example, I can know only a posteriori that Jodie Foster's son has red hair. In order to know that, I must have had a chance to see Jodie Foster's son, that is, a particular experience. Similarly, I can know only a posteriori that there are 9 planets in our solar system, or that the average household income in New Jersey is higher than the average household income in Tennessee. In addition to the terms a priori and a posteriori, it is useful to understand the terms necessary truth and contingent truth. A proposition is contingently true if its truth depends on how the actual world is. For example, whether the sentence Britney Spears has sold more records than Madonna is true depends on whether Britney Spears has indeed sold more records than Madonna. So, this proposition is contingently true. Similarly, the sentences Abraham Lincoln was shot in a theater and the Broncos won 2 successive Super Bowl titles express contingent truths. On the other hand, the sentence if Britney Spears has a female sibling, then Britney Spears has a sister is true, whether Britney Spears actually has a sister or not. Similarly, the sentences the number 9 is larger than the number 3 and every rose is a flower express necessary truths. A good way to determine whether a sentence is contingently true or necessarily true is to ask if it is logically possible that the sentence could be false. For example, it is logically possible that the sentence Abraham Lincoln was shot in a theater is false, for we can imagine a situation in which Abraham Lincoln was not shot at all. It follows therefore that the sentence expresses a contingent truth. On the other hand, it is not logically possible that the number 9 is smaller than the number 3 or that roses are not flowers. A tight connection exists between necessary truths and a priori knowledge, and between contingent truths and a posteriori knowledge. If we can know something a priori, i.e., prior to looking at the world, the truth must be a necessary truth. On the other hand, if we know something a posteriori, i.e., with the help of experience, the truth must be a contingent truth. A rationalist maintains that there are important necessary truths that we can know only on the basis of a priori reasoning, and that these necessary truths form the foundation of all our knowledge. The case for rationalism. A fair number of thinkers do not find rationalism all that plausible. They ask, what are these great necessary truths that we are supposed to know on the basis of reason alone? At first glance this seems like a reasonable complaint, but if we look more carefully, we can see that rationalism is a more persuasive element in our knowledge than is initially apparent. To illustrate this, let us consider the text of the Declaration of Independence, written in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government. What is striking here is the reference to self-evidence. The crucial claims of the Declaration of Independence are presented as self-evident truths, that is, truths that are justified in light of reason alone. Moreover, the claims at issue, namely, that all men have equal rights and that people have the right to revolt against their government if it fails to protect them in their rights are, if they are true, necessarily true. For it is not a contingent feature of humans to have moral rights. If humans do have fundamental moral rights, they have them necessarily. This suggests that moral knowledge is justified predominantly on the basis of a priori reasoning. The weakness with this line of reasoning is, of course, that not all people agree that moral claims are true or false. That is, there are many people who are skeptics about moral claims. We will discuss this issue more thoroughly in Chapter 8, but for now, we can suggest a conditional argument in defense of rationalism, which takes the logical form of modus ponens. 1. If we have moral and political knowledge, then rationalism plays an important role in justifying our beliefs. 2. We have moral and political knowledge. Therefore, rationalist plays an important role in justifying our beliefs. A second argument in defense of rationalism is based on the claim that a priori knowledge does not seem to be as vulnerable to a certain type of skepticism as empirical knowledge is. We have seen that empiricism goes hand in hand with the natural sciences, but they are in a constant process of change. Physicists used to believe that matter was made out of indivisible, small, solid particles, i.e., atoms. Then they discovered that atoms themselves consisted of parts, and that atoms were not solid pieces of matter but contained a good deal of empty space. Now scientists have even detected that electrons and neutrons have parts, and no end to this process of new discoveries is in sight. Thus, empirical claims are always subject to revision, which has convinced some philosophers that the natural sciences do not produce genuine knowledge, but only beliefs. Genuine knowledge is supposed to be timeless and unchanging. The philosopher Plato first raised this objection against empirical knowledge. Plato was a rationalist and did not think that empirical investigations of the physical world could lead to genuine knowledge, only to beliefs. Plato, like all rationalists, was much more impressed by the knowledge of mathematics. He thought that a mathematical proof, once discovered, would not later be revised. In truth, when we learn classical geometry today, we learn the same proofs that the Greek mathematician Euclid discovered more than 2000 years ago. Unlike natural science, mathematics does seem to lead to knowledge that is eternal and solidly justified in light of reason. Thus, the gist of this argument is to increase the importance of a priori knowledge by discrediting the status of empirical knowledge. A convinced rationalist might therefore say that if there is any knowledge, it must be a priori knowledge, since empirical investigation produces only beliefs. Problems for rationalism. Despite the support for a priori justification, rationalism faces some serious challenges. One of the more influential challenges goes back to the writings of David Hume but was most prominently advocated by a group of 20th century philosophers called logical positivists. Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, Moritz Schlick, 1882–1936, and Carl Gustav Hempel, 1905–1997, were some of the most prominent members of this group. Logical positivists were committed empiricists who believed that a priori knowledge had only limited value. To understand their attack on rationalism and a priori reasoning, we need to understand the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths. Consider the following sentence: all electrons are subatomic particles. This sentence is obviously true, but it is true for trivial reasons. An electron is by definition a certain type of subatomic particle. Thus, we can know that the sentence is true simply by analyzing the meaning of the word electron. No observations are necessary in order to determine whether the sentence is true. Sentences of this type express analytic truths, and analytically true sentences are true simply by virtue of the meanings of the words involved. Other examples of analytic sentences are all bachelors are not married or all birches are trees. Of course, most sentences are not analytically true. For instance, the sentence electrons have less mass than neutrons cannot be determined to be true by analyzing the meaning of the word electron. In order to find out whether this sentence is true, we need to conduct experiments and observations. Sentences of this kind are called synthetic sentences. Further examples of synthetic sentences are George Bush owns a Ford Focus or New York City has more inhabitants than Lincoln, Nebraska. Once we have grasped the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, it is easy to see that there is something trivial about analytic truths. If somebody tells me, all bachelors are unmarried men, I can immediately see that what I'm hearing is true, but the truth is not very interesting. Analytic truths do not contain information about the world, but rather information about how we use the words in our language. Once we understand this feature of analytic truths, we can appreciate the attack of logical positivism on rationalism. However, that attack is devastating for a rationalist who claims that a priori reasoning is a key element in all our knowledge. To resist this attack, a rationalist has to show that there are important necessary truths that we can know a priori but that are not analytic. One option is to point to important moral claims like all humans have equal rights. If these claims are true, they are necessarily true, and the claims are synthetic, not analytic. But this move is problematic. Because logical positivists deny that we have moral knowledge, arguments that appeal to moral knowledge are not always effective. A second defense for rationalists is to claim that there are important synthetic and necessary truths that shape our understanding of the physical universe. Traditionally, rationalists have claimed, for instance, that the sentences every event has a cause or the shortest distance between 2 points in space is a straight line are synthetic and necessary truths about the universe. The problem here is that progress in science suggests that these seemingly self-evident truths are not only contingent but probably even false. Thus, the rationalist seems to have only one escape from the attack of logical positivism, the rationalist's all-time favorite field of knowledge, namely mathematical truths. However, even the status of mathematical truths is hotly debated. Many positivists, for instance, have favored the idea that mathematics ultimately reduces to analytic truths as well. Whether rationalists can escape the attack of logical positivism is an open question and is still debated among contemporary philosophers. No clear answer to the question has yet emerged. Final remarks on epistemology. 3.3 Explain the influence of theories of knowledge in evaluating arguments. It is time to draw some conclusions from our introduction to epistemology. We can answer the question of whether we have knowledge in 3 fundamental ways. First, we can be skeptics and claim that we know very little and that most of our so-called knowledge is, in fact, nothing more than a bunch of beliefs. A dose of skepticism is a necessary ingredient of all philosophy. If we are too confident that we know what the world is like, we will not ask the necessary questions that initiate philosophical reflection. However, the crucial epistemological question is whether we can prevent skepticism from turning into global skepticism and thus undermining all our philosophical and scientific knowledge. Descartes' method of doubt did not produce an entirely satisfactory response to global skepticism. Fallible versions of either empiricism or rationalism seem more promising. An empiricist argues that we can know that P if we can justify P a posteriori in light of our experiences of the world. A rationalist, on the other hand, maintains that we can know that P if we can show a priori that P is necessarily true. Both positions have their strengths and weaknesses. In actual philosophical conversation, most people appeal to a priori justification as well as a posteriori justification. It is, however, important to determine what kind of justification plays the more fundamental role. An answer to this question will not only influence our strategy for resisting skepticism, but will also influence how we approach and evaluate arguments. An empiricist, for instance, will be skeptical toward premises that cannot be justified by our experiences. A rationalist, on the other hand, will try to solve philosophical questions predominantly with the help of a priori considerations. Equipped with these basic epistemological and logical tools, we are ready to explore some classical philosophical problems. Study and reflection questions. 1. Is global skepticism a self-defeating philosophical position? If yes, does this mean that skepticism is not a problem? If not, can you say what global skepticism is without undermining your own position? 2. Can you know that you are awake at this very moment? If yes, please describe precisely how you might establish this. Would Descartes be satisfied with your answer? 3. We know that the average temperature on Earth has undergone dramatic changes in the past. There have been ice ages and periods of warm weather. Suppose that we develop a climate model that allows us to understand precisely why and how the temperature in the past has changed on Earth. Would this model allow us to predict how the temperature on Earth will develop in the future? Explain your answer as clearly as you can. For, is the world as it really is, i.e., independent of our experiences, identical to the world we perceive with our senses? 5. Is it possible to know that something is true simply by thinking about it? If yes, give some examples of these truths. Do you think that these kinds of truths are important in developing a satisfactory big-picture view of the world? If your answer is no, please explain your reasoning as clearly as you can.